And namaste and welcome everybody to the third session of Bayesian neural networks and linear models using MCMC. So in the previous session, we discussed about MCMC, log likelihood. Why should we use MCMC? What should MCMC be used for? And we went over basic case where we went over code for linear models, a Bayesian linear model, actually more specifically a linear regression used for prediction problem. And we saw the code where we used, so the implementation of the likelihood function and the prior and the sampler with the number of samples running in this for loop. So as I said yesterday that before the for loop, we do initialize all the things needed, which includes the looking for where the data is, what is the model size, how are we going to save the parameters, the history of the posterior of weights and biases, the history of the tau parameter, tau squared parameter, we could say, yes, and then we need to initialize the weights. We are saving the predictions, and we need to define the hyperparameters of the prior, and the sigma squared of 5 basically looks at the distribution of the normal distribution, which we use for the prior, and nu1, nu2 are essentially the inverse gamma hyperparameters. So we sample and obtain probability distribution of the weights and biases. So, and then we take them and we run trials, can be 10, 100, or 1,000, where we draw from those probability distributions of the weights and the biases. And we insert them into the linear model and get the predictions and on the test data. So this is how specifically you test. Note that these predictions that you generally get, you can either use the mean or the mode here. So when you use the mode here, what happens is because we are looking at multi-model posterior distribution, some of them will be not exactly with one mode. So in this case, we have one mode and that is useful. But in the previous case examples, as I showed here, they are multi-model posterior distributions. And in this case, the mean, because there are several modes, few to several modes, then the mean does not really represent the mode. So it is usually better to use the mode rather than the mean, because we have a multi-model posterior distribution. So what happens with the mean versus the mode? You can do that exercise, experiment. Basically, in this case, when you do the trials, so in here, what we are doing is we are using normal distribution here. And when you give a normal distribution, you give the mean basically that defines the distribution. When you give use the mode as the mean, then that would be kind of defining a similar distribution, and that would be more exact. And what the difference that you will notice firstly is that the RMSE mean on the train that you get here, the RMSE mean on the train that you get here, that would be better than the RMSE mean that you get here, because this is your drawing from the distribution, from a train distribution, whereas this is like you got the RMSE values right from the exact value that was proposed, right? So in this sense, why did we do this? Is because usually when you do research on Bayesian models, Bayesian inference, especially in the Bayesian neural networks and Bayesian deep learning literature, then you usually compare those results with conventional deep learning models, right? So you compare those results with conventional deep learning models, and this gives you more exact results to compare with them with. But this is more implementing the whole philosophy of drawing from a distribution in real time. So these are the two differences. Now what we are going to do, we are going to move on with that whole debate and thought process, and we are going to apply that to neural networks. So what is a Bayesian neural network? Simply, a Bayesian neural network is a neural network which has been trained by a Bayesian inference algorithm. And an example of a Bayesian inference algorithm is the MCMC sampler, Markov chain Monte Carlo sampler. And what happens is you can assume you can have a fully probabilistic neural network model, as in this case, where all the weights and parameters are represented as probability distributions. It's a small neural network, so you can do that. But sometimes in very large neural networks, such as autoencoders, and even larger deep learning models, where you have millions of weights and biases, it is probably better to only use the second hidden layer or the output layer, the weight links connected to the output layer, use the Bayesian probabilistic weights and biases there, and here you can use the conventional ones. So that is one way to reduce the number of parameters, but of course you have a less catering for uncertainty quantification than a fully probabilistic neural network. But then the other thing is going fully probabilistic with so many weights and biases will take you huge computational demands, and at times you are going to get a slightly inferior or more inferior results because you are drawing from multimodal posterior distributions, which is sampling multimodal posterior distributions. As such, given here is difficult. So in the figure, what you see is, and basically a neural network, which is having a multi-step ahead time series prediction problem where you have the input steps, a window size, and the five steps you are predicting, and there's a sliding window approach. And below that, we have, what we have is MCMC sampler, right? Trying to sample the different weights and biases. So all these weights and their biases, they are having separate distributions. And you start and you have a set of them, right? And each of them can have either unimodal or multimodal distribution. And in the case of neural networks, we also assume we are also going to use a normal or Gaussian prior or Gaussian likelihood, because we are going to first look at the case where we are going to do some sort of prediction. So it's a regression problem, as shown there. So we have a Gaussian likelihood. So otherwise, all the other things are the same, right? You have the weights and biases. Just going back to the previous case, the Bayesian linear model, the linear regression, note we did not use any gradient descent. We were just proposing you by adding noise, random noise. So the random noise, you can see them as gradients, and they work quite well for smaller models, right? A linear model in a small neural network with, a few dozen of parameters. So we are going to first look at a case where we are going to use random, and that probability distribution is known as a random walk proposal distribution. So we are going to use that for neural networks. So we are not going to use any gradients in the beginning. And then later in the lesson, we are going to see how we can utilize gradients, okay? So what we have here is the likelihood function, which is exactly the same as the previous one, right? Except there's the only minor change is that the number of parameters in the likelihood function. And that theta basically is the weights and biases from the input to the hidden and hidden to the output layer, whereas that would be quite less in the case of a linear regression model. And the prior is exactly the same as the linear model, right? We are using the same signal to noise model plus noise model. It's just a prediction problem. And we are having the inverse gamma prior for the tau squared parameter. And we are having normal distribution, normal prior for the weights and the biases. And the log form of them are given below, and the log is given here. So that's the log likelihood and the log prior. And that is what is going to be used to implement this. And note that, once again, we are basing this lesson mostly on the Bayesian neural networks by MCMC, which is a Python-based tutorial, where all the tutorial has code notebooks apart from Python code. So some of the key references are given below. And next, what we are going to do, we are going to look at the neural network code. We're just going to code jump into the neural network and code some based from some of my previous papers. Firstly, what we have is, and instead of a linear model, in this case, what are we going to have is a neural network, right? That's what we're going to have. Instead of a linear model, neural network, and you have seen this code from previous lessons. But if you have not, note that we have W1 weights from the input to the hidden bias of the hidden layer. We assume that we are only having one hidden layer neural network, a simple neural network, weights from the hidden to the output, and the bias of the output layer. A vector, we were saving the predictions of the hidden and predictions of the output. And a sigmoid function, error function, squared error loss. And this code is basically implementing backpropagation, and it's built on the backpropagation neural network code. So it also has the backward pass code in there. So what we do, we are not using the backward pass code in there. It's just there, it's just left there, right? So we're not using that. So what do we have decode? So we have another, assume that there's another class, which is a MCMC class, as you can see here. This is the class that will call this class network class, a neural network class, and initialize that network class with training data, training and test data, and the network topology. And it will then pass it a set of weights and biases for it to insert into the neural network, right? Probably the correct function would be encode, but if we have decode, but so be it. So we have the weights and biases. It's note that in the case of neural networks, we are not having a vector of weights and biases, but we have two matrices and vectors, right? Meaning that we have the W1 matrix, W2 matrix, bias 2, which is a vector, bias 1, which is a vector. But they are all flattened. They are all flattened. And assume that they are flattened, and then you kind of break away them into smaller pieces, right? And then decode and then encode into this, the weight 1, weight 2, bias 1, and bias 2. So this is what the code is. It's basically going into chunks of the vector and getting the layer 1 weights out and layer 2 weights out, layer 1 biases out, and layer 2 biases out. So then once that's done, then it basically, so that decode is run in this by this evaluate proposal function, right? And this is very similar to BP with stochastic gradient descent or gradient descent. So as I said, it decodes the W into W1, W2, V1, V2, looks at the size of the data, and gets initializes the input and the desired, and kind of traverses into the entire data set using one by one. So it's not, there's no stochastic element in here, but you can implement the stochastic element as well. And you just do a normal forward pass over feed-forward neural network. You get the predictions out, and then you return the predictions. Where do you return the predictions? You return the predictions to the calling function. And where is the calling function? It is in the likelihood function of the MCMC class. So it is neural network dot evaluate proposal. You get all the predictions. You calculate your likelihood loss, and you get your prior. Very similar. The prior is there as similar to the other case, but in here this is almost the same as in the linear model, but in the case of the prior, it's also almost the same, but except that we have this number of hidden neurons and number of input neurons. We are trying to find what is the actual size, how many neurons we are dealing. So that's what this is doing. So it's just number of hidden neurons. But this would be just the size of the neural network. And note that that includes the bias, number of biases. So, I mean, there's one way of doing this, and another way is just passing the size as a parameter. So we have a sampler, and in the sampler, what we have the same thing as in the previous case, and it's the linear models. But the weight size, as you can see, is based on the topology, and the topology is defined. Where is the topology defined? The topology would be defined in the main, where we say that many hidden, that many input, and that many output, and that is the MCMC class is called there. And there we basically pass the topology, right? We pass the training data, test data, number of samples, and the MCMC sampler dot sampler is run, and it gives us all this information, right? So, and we can select what problem, 1, 2, or 3. In here, we are looking at the 3 time series prediction problems. So here we go back. Note that we took that topology as we said, and we defined the neural network by calling the neural network class, right? So this happens once. Once the sampler is called, the neural network class is defined, and then multiple times we are going to iteratively sample, right? And multiple times is defined by the number of samples. Can be 1,000, can be 10,000 samples. But your class is created only once. Your neural network topology is all defined only once. So they are fixed. So similar to the previous case, after the neural network topology is defined, we take the set of proposals that were given initially, the weights in the weight proposals, and we evaluate the train and the test, and we get the eta tau proposal. We set up our prior, and the prior can be, it's basically tells the spread. It can be 5, 20, 30, depending on whatever assumptions you want to make. and this is saying that the spread is large. But I would say that smaller value, 5 or 10, would also work there. So some of these things you can experimentally decide, right, by running some experiments. And actually what happens is if these values are not right, your the random walk that we are doing, see the weight, the step size, this eta, all these things that are there, it took us a while to really get these values for this, and that I did back in 2017. And then some of my students, including Ratnil and Arpit Kapoor, Ratnil, they have also been working with these Bayesian neural networks in their PhD and also fine-tuning some of these things. And it's an interesting field, but the hyperparameter tuning part is challenging. So once you kind of know these values work for these set type of problems, then we just use it and kind of move on with life, right? So they worked and we were okay, fine, but they are not as optimal as we want to be. So we may need to really get back and change some values at times to get better results. So we have the proposal and we do the eta proposal, tau proposal, and that's the first step where we draw from the distribution. The second step is we evaluate, get the likelihood. In order to get the likelihood, we look at the train data, the test data, right? And I said in the previous lesson, for the test data, it's ignore, we don't really need to use it. Then we get the prior proposal and then we compute the difference because we are computing the ratio in the Metropolis Hastings loss function is given here, and that's what it's implementing, that that the ratio, the division is the subtraction, and then your P and Qs are multiplied, and that is actually the multiplication is the addition because we are in log space. Okay, so because we are in log space, so then we get those values. So basically we compute the Metropolis Hastings, we get the Metropolis Hastings probability, and then we use that to either accept or reject the proposal. If it is accepted, we print it out. If it is rejected, we do not say anything. So here we can see that we do only the printing after when I modulus 50 means for every 50th sample, okay? Because it becomes too many print statements. And here we are trying to, as we are doing this, we are trying to plot it. Otherwise, you do not accept, you retain. Basically, you retain the previous values and that's it. The number of acceptance you can calculate because you are incrementing the number of accepted samples. And then you return all these things, the set of predictions of the train test, set of predictions of the test set. This is throughout the history, of sampling, and we are looking at 10,000, 1,000 samples. But we've done experiments all the way to 100,000 samples actually in some of my previous papers to see how things are. And we report the RMSE train test predictions. We return the posterior and the posterior of the tau and the posterior of the weights and the biases. We get all those values, and then on them we can do the burning part where we discard the first. In this case, it's 10% of the samples we are discarding. Then they are just trying to plot. We're trying to plot all the predictions. So this what we get is the mean of all the accepted samples and their standard deviation. But we, from the standard deviation, we can calculate the percentile. So this is 95th percentile and the 5th percentile. They are used for plotting, and we get the standard deviation of the mean, RMSE training test, and the rest. So you can run this, and you will see some of those plots, and what we are plotting also the weights and the biases. And what we see is all those accepted samples. It's kind of not really useful, but it's just for visualization purpose. So you see that that's, a lot of uncertainty is there. That means the model has not really done that well, and we are trying to save that. And all the weights and biases of the neural network, we are making a box plot of it. Because if we do plots, it will be a lot of plots. But we can make this into, because we were sampling only, so the train RMSE is 0.12, and that's the standard deviation 0.05, and the test RMSE is 0.12, and so it's around 0.12. So we can run it again with 10,000 samples and see what we get. So now when we're doing the 10,000 samples, basically the first 1,000 samples are discarded. This is as you can see that it's as it is sampling, it is showing the results, meaning this here is the set of weights and biases that were proposed and are accepted. In the here that's what it is printing there. So right, so now you can see that it's a bit messy, but we see that then the uncertainties are coming closer to the predictions, right? So now so it was 0.12, but now it's 0.01 train, and sorry, 0.02 train. So and it was 0.12 before. So and I'll just so you can always try different step size. For example, you can go a little bit higher here, and okay, we'll just keep the same step size, but I just wanted to show that the results will also change when you take the burn-in, like the burn-in is larger. So in this case here, like the burn-in is very small, and we have used a large burn-in because it takes a while for neural networks to really converge towards a quite acceptable training performance. So now when your burn-in is 0.5, basically if you're doing 10,000 samples, that essentially means that a lot of the first half of your posterior is completely discarded, right? So you kind of are using a random walk. And note, it's a kind of unbelievable, but it is what it is, that we are training a neural network with a random walk proposal distribution. We are not using any gradients. So adding very small noise in accepting and rejecting it over time based on some criteria, we can train a neural network just as you do with a backpropagation. So now it is saying around 32 was accepted, right? And okay, this case, it's not as great as I thought. Let's see we have although we discarded it's either 10% or either 50% in this case, the result, the RMSE train result on the test result doesn't change that much. So then the other things that you can always try to run is, changing stuff like this, sigma squared, and so does it really change much? So, and the acceptance rate. So we are around 32% acceptance. And in linear models and in the Bayesian stats literature, they say it's good to get around 25% acceptance sample to really effectively construct a nice posterior distribution. Should be done in a few seconds. So as an exercise, basically, you can try different types of prediction problems, different data sets. You can amend this to multivariate time series, multiple step ahead time series. You can apply to regression problems such as the abalone regression problem. And so now in this case, we get a little better results. So, but yeah, so the RMSE values are similar. Anyway, so we move into the next topic is Langevin Bayesian neural networks. Also, I have kind of, to make it more clear, I call it the Langevin gradient Bayesian neural networks. So what is this? We have the Bayesian neural networks where you have the input, weights, and biases, probability distributions, right? And essentially probability distributions. And we have trained the neural network with a random walk proposal distribution. A Langevin gradient is a proposal distribution. It is similar to a random walk proposal distribution, but it incorporates the Gaussian noise. The Gaussian noise is the random walk proposal distribution, but then it uses the gradients, right? It fuses the gradients with the Gaussian noise to give more hints from gradient descent to improve the training. Okay, so how do we do this? Firstly, going into the maths, we go into the maths, and then we'll go into the code as usual, right? So a Langevin gradient proposal distribution is just a one-step gradient proposal distribution. One step meaning that for one sample, let's say you have 1,000 sample, but you have then for in that 1,000 sample for a chain or an iteration in that sample, you do a random walk. Then you pass that set of weights and biases to the neural network, and then it gets the gradient, but it gets the gradient only for one step, one epoch. It does not do it for 10 epochs or 100 epochs. It just does for one step, and then it returns that, and then it's used. Then you either accept or reject the proposal, and then you carry on. So that's why it's called a one step. We will see that in the code implementation, it will become more clear. And Gaussian distribution with the standard deviation, meaning we are looking at a covariance matrix, and we are saying the standard deviation with giving sigma. And then there's a mean calculated with a gradient-based update of the parameters in the previous step. So essentially what you have is a multivariate normal distribution. And in the multivariate normal distribution, instead of having the mean as 0, right? When you are drawing in a random walk, you have a 0 mean. But in this case, we have instead of that, we have incorporated the gradients, the theta, using the delta. So that theta theta bar is the theta, that means the set of weights and biases, plus the learning rate, R is the learning rate, multiplied by the gradients. That's the gradients. The delta E is the gradients of the neuron, right? So gradients multiplied by the learning rate, that's where what you kind of use to do your weight update. And that you add to the current, and that's a new set of weights. That is something you put it as the center or in place of the mean of the multivariate normal distribution, and then you draw from there. Okay. So when you draw from there, because that's the standard deviation is very small, it's kind of doing a random walk on the gradients. So it's infusing the random walk with the gradients. So as you can say, the learning rate is R and the gradient update. This part is given by, you look at the square error loss and you find the gradients, right? So that's what it's trying to say. But life is not so easy afterwards. The thing is that because we are not in the previous cases, when we are doing a random work, when we see in the Bayesian world, it is all about updating your current status based on the past and present information, right? So that's why we have this Metropolis Hastings is using the Bayesian update principles here, which is kind of looking at the past and your current and then calculating this probability, right? And the reason we are doing this is because we need to ensure that we have a detailed balance condition, which is one of the conditions for having a Markov chain is enforced, right? We need a detailed balance condition to meet to converge. So what a detailed balance condition basically does is it just ensures that you effectively sample from the posterior distribution. So I'll just go back. Remember that we talked about the detailed balance condition, and in here, right? And so we effectively sample from the posterior distribution. What does effectively sampling from the posterior distribution means? It means that if this is your posterior distribution, you should not just sample around here. If you just sample around here too much, and you will have another you're not really sampling the right, all the portions of the posterior distribution. You should sample both sides. So that's the detailed balance condition, enforcing the detailed balance condition that effectively sample all the parts of the posterior distribution. So that becomes a problem. This has not been a problem so far when you're using a random walk sampler, because in the random walk sampler, you have, when you are using a random walk sampler, you have the same step size of the random walk. And that kind of, with that, you do not need to cater for the proposal distribution, for the detailed, you do not cater for the proposal distribution in the Metropolis Hastings step, right? Whereas in this case, we need to cater for the proposal distribution, because we are not using the random walk proposal distribution anymore. We are using the Langevin gradient proposal distribution. So we are going to see that in a bit. So this is almost the same as the previous one. So you have the likelihood, and to get the likelihood, and then you have the previous and the current, and you get you compute the ratio, So likelihood and the prior, right? So likelihood and the prior. Where P and can be computed using the likelihood and the prior. So note that the the superscript P in this theta, it actually refers to the proposal. Okay. P refers to the proposal, and S means current, where you are currently in the sample, in the chain. S is current. So that's what it means. And this is the, in this case, because we are going to consider, we are considering a Langevin gradient proposal distribution. We need to compute the Q ratio in here. And this ratio is proposed and current values of the proposal distribution. So we are going to compute the ratio for the proposal distribution. And we got the one-step gradient, and in here we got the prior, right? In the log, we have the prior, and you have the likelihood of you have the likelihood. So you can see the log, the like is the log likelihood y and theta, and y and the prior, right? We give the prior and we do this, right? So these two are the conventional things that we did in Bayesian neural networks and Bayesian linear models with random walk. And in that random walk, we did not consider this part. This is the ratio of the proposal distribution, right? That we need to consider in this part. Why? Because at every stage of the sampling process, your gradient steps are not fixed. Your gradients can, sometimes the gradients will be small, sometimes the gradients are large. So we, in order to accommodate that in the uncertain, as a form of uncertainty, let's say, and to ensure that we meet the detailed balance condition, you need to do this bit. Okay, it's a bit hard to grasp. And in here, what we are doing, the Q ratio, we are basically in probability of the data. We have the, we get the likelihood, no, the data given. In this case, to get the likelihood, we have the data given the set of weights and biases of the model. So the data given the model, and the previous, and the, for the prior, it is just the model. There's no data, right? And we are, the posterior is the model given the data, right? And in here we have the proposal, past proposal given current proposal. We are computing that ratio. The past proposal given the current proposal, right? So moving on here, we have the same likelihood function as before. We have the same prior function as before, right? And we have the same other functions, but we have, in the case of the neural network, we had the decode. We have now another function called the Langevin gradient function. And what the Langevin gradient function does, it does the decode part, right? And then it runs the forward pass, and it just runs the backward pass for all the training examples, right, in the data set. And this is just done one for one epoch. So we do not have epoch in there because we are not doing multiple times. So we're just doing one. So that is what's the new thing that's added in your neural network class. So the Langevin dynamics also, and it's called Langevin MCMC as well. Compute the gradients, draw from the distribution using those gradients, and propose. Yeah, use that those gradients to make the proposal, and obtain the acceptance criteria, either accept or reject. So now that the Q ratio, the proposal ratio, in order to compute the proposal ratio and to implement the Langevin gradients, we have, let's say, two implementations, right? So this is what, firstly, let's assume that there was no Langevin gradients. It was just a standard random walk, right? If it's a standard random walk sampler, then we just say that we do not need to compute the proposal, the Q ratio, right? We do not need to compute the Q ratio. Basically, that's a standard neural network. As I said, we do not need to compute this. Why? Because we are using random walk proposal distribution, and the random walk is based on the same step size throughout the sampling process. So we do not need to do this. But in the case of Langevin gradients, we need to do that. And that's why there's the case of the Langevin gradients. That's this one. If, let's say, we want to use Langevin gradients. And in this implementation, what we have done is we have a probability of using Langevin gradients. So we say that the Langevin gradient probability is, let's say, 0.5. That means half of the time we are going to use a standard proposal distribution. The other half of the time we are going to use a Langevin proposal distribution. But note that in the Langevin proposal distribution, firstly, what we do is we do a neural network, get the Langevin gradients. What we do is whatever the weights, the current step at the weights and biases, we pass that to the Langevin gradient function, right? And then we get the gradients, right? That function returns the gradients. We take the gradient and we put it as the center in the normal, in the distribution. And we put a step is your variance, which is a user-defined parameter. And using that, we get the W proposal, right? So this is the proposal that we get. So this proposal is kind of equivalent to a random walk proposal, right? Kind of like you can either use this or you use this, right? So what we do next is the code that's done next is to calculate the Q ratio, of the proposal distribution, right? So this part actually does calculate this, and or also this, right? That's the log version. So we do that to get the Q ratio of this. We need to know where are we in the space. That means we need to see the Q ratio is a ratio of the present and the future, right? So we've got the future, that's the weight proposal, right? And of the future, we make a copy of the future and we get what would be if we put that future proposal and get a Langevin gradient out of that again. So we get the gradients of the proposal. So we got the gradients of the current, right? So we got the gradient of the current proposal, and then we are getting the gradients of the proposal, right? So, and we take those gradients of the current and the proposal, and we compute the log probabilities. So we draw from the multivariate distribution. Why? Because we are using, uh, we are drawing, in order to get them, we need to evaluate, we need to get the likelihood and to get the Q ratio. And we are drawing from the, we need to put them into a multivariate normal distribution, which is the first is the top and the second is the bottom. So that's the first is the proposal and the bottom is the current. So this is the first and this is the second, right? So that's what we can say, the first, the second. So the first is the top, and that first is computed by placing that vector into the multivariate normal distribution. But when you do that, you are going to get a numerical error because this neural network, although it's small, it is a vector size of the weights and biases more than 30. With the multivariate normals, you can work only with a smaller vector size. So, but because you note that in the multivariate normal distribution, we are having something EXP there. So the EXP, and we are in the log space, and then EXP and the log part kind of cancels out, right? So the EXP and the log part cancels out. Going back to the multivariate normal, you can see there's a EXP, right? EXP, and we are doing a log of that EXP. So that kind of cancels out, and then we just assume that this part in here, that part we will and that part what we are doing is we're taking a bit of a simplification here. We're taking a simplification. We are kind of saying that cancels out, and this, the inside one is what we get here. The change, the W minus W proposal gradient is the WP delta. And then we have the WC delta, WP delta. And this is essentially the things that are inside the multivariate distribution. If you cancel, when the log and the EXP cancels out, so we compute this, and this, the first is see, that's that computation in the multivariate distribution. So the first is essentially this, but taking the log things out, and the second is essentially the second. So what this much of the code has done, it has basically computed the Q ratio. I know it's a bit messy in the first time. You need to kind of think about this and look at this video over and over again. And you can, of course, ask me questions and put questions in the forum and comments, and so that I can respond to them. So that's basically it. That's the Langevin gradients, and the rest is the same. Basically, you have the eta proposal, you have the likelihood function, you call the prior. The difference comes here. This is like this is just an implementation to ensure that we do not have numerical instabilities or overflow error. So that's just an implementation when we implement it. It's the same thing, but in terms of the Langevin gradients, we have the prior, right? The difference of the prior, the difference of the likelihood. So it's the ratio of the likelihoods, past and proposed, uh, uh, past and proposed, and the difference of the proposal, which is the Q ratio. And that difference of the proposal, we essentially computed here, first minus second. Because minus is, it's a ratio. So the numerator and the denominator. And it's in log space. So that's why we do that. So if you run, so these results are from this paper where we implemented this first, and we did this for a long set of samples, 100,000 samples to see how things are going. And we are comparing with gradient descent and a gradient descent and a MCMC. The gradient descent star is a shorter gradient descent time, and the gradient descent is again with we just let it run for the same for a very long time. And the MCMC and the Langevin dynamics MCMC, you can see the train and test. The Langevin dynamics MC in most of the case. MCMC is just a random walk MCMC, and the Langevin dynamics MCMC in most of the case achieves better RMSE results for the same number of samples. So, and it gets more number of accepted samples, whereas in the MCMC is very small number of accepted samples, and around 25 to 30% is the healthy accepted samples. So we see that this is was not. So these accepted number of accepted samples and all these values, RMSE values, this all comes with really difficult hyperparameter tuning. So we go back to understanding the detailed balance for the proposal distribution. Again, that's the Q ratio. I've kind of explained it already. And it essentially means we're drawing proposed, and K is the, let's say, current. And we are drawing from the distribution, taking the Q bar is the gradient-based weight update of the current, and then there's the gradient weight update of the proposed. The covariance, so the step size remains the same, and we take them into account, and then we compute this. So what is actually happening? So as I said, that we have a posterior distribution, and you can visualize the posterior distribution. This is what we are trying to go to. Proposal distribution. So we have a prior distribution. You can assume that there is some prior distribution as well somewhere. And we have a proposal distribution. Proposal distribution is your sets of weights and biases on which you are doing the random, right? And when you are doing a random walk, you are basically traversing the posterior distribution. So you had an initial, you had a proposed, right? And sometimes the initial is there and you could propose it in here. So initial, proposed. So the initial and the proposed. So what happens is you can see that the step size, the proposal distribution, this proposal distribution step size is the same throughout the sampling process for a random walk sampling. But it can vary, and if your step size is large, very large, like this, then your proposal distribution shape becomes large, right? And it can just, the uncertainties become higher in sampling effectively from different regions of the where a posterior distribution. Whereas when your step size is constant, you can well sample along this and keep on moving around. But when that size, the step size is so large, you're not so sure how you're going to sample. So that's the reason we need to account for that. And that step size, that posterior distribution, just imagine when it is this, you can assume it's for a random walk proposal distribution. But when it is, for example, a Langevin gradient proposal distribution, your proposal distribution step size changes drastically. So for sample one, it may be this, something like this, but sample two, it may become this. Sample three, it will become again this small one. Sample 4, 5, it becomes this. It depends because your step size is changing because of differences in the changes in the gradient. And you do not know where and how effectively you are traversing the distribution. And hence you need to account for that using the Q ratio. So this is basically putting all of them together, right? So the previous code. And we'll take a 5 minutes break. And then we will continue for the Bayesian neural networks for classification and convergence diagnosis, some advances, and MCMC will probably be done in another 40 minutes, okay, in the next session. Thank you, everyone. I'll rejoin the session in 5 minutes.